Right, so let's continue. What I wanted to do was I just, in our IS diagram that we had here, and I said that the A plus I plus G minus BT plus X minus M, this was all the intercept, and I just wanted to make clear that that is, in fact, the intercept. If we're writing aggregate expenditure as a function of all its things, and I've left out I here, plus I, then you can see that aggregate expenditure has a straight line. If I were to write this as you are used to seeing it in the form y equals mx plus c, obviously x corresponds to y here, and y corresponds to AE. So our aggregate expenditure, here's our here's our independent variable, so here's our independent variable, here's our dependent variable, here's our dependent variable, here's our intercept. You can see all of these terms that do not have y in them are the intercepts. Okay? So just if you're wondering how we got from this equation here to this being the intercept, it's because if we just rewrite this equation with c as a function of y, then we have that aggregate expenditure equals a plus by, and nothing else in this equation except for this term here is dependent on y. Okay? So all these other terms here just go into c. Okay? Oops. Let me just neaten that up. So plus I, and then I would be, oh man. Okay, plus I would be one of the intercept terms. Okay. What I want you to do is get out a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen or some writing implement. And then team yourself up with a friend, and the question I'm going to ask you is the following. In our real money market, okay, so we've got a real money market, we've got a real money supply, and we've got a real money demand. If I increase the price level, so prices now, we assume prices are no longer fixed, we increase the price level. When we increase the price level, what happens in the money market? And we'd like you to draw that. With a diagram, illustrate to me what happens when the price level rises. Just the price level, nothing else changing, just the price level. There's nothing that you need to copy from these slides. It's just a money market, price level changes, illustrate using a money market, what happens. Okay? So if we're dealing with the real money markets, price level rises, what happens? What about money demand? If the price level goes up, does that change the real value of goods that you're buying? No, it would change the nominal value of the goods that you're buying. So it wouldn't affect our real money demand, because our real money demand depends on the real goods and services that we're buying, right? Not the nominal value of them. So it wouldn't shift our real money demand. What else could it do? We definitely discussed this in chapter 25. When the price level goes up, right? Remember, if we've got a real money supply is dependent on the quantity of actual money in circulation, right? Now, if we've got some quantity of money in circulation, that quantity as a real value, right? How do we determine the real value of that quantity? It's dependent on the amount of real goods and services it can buy, right? So in other words, if I have 100 rand, right? 100 1 rand coins. I have 100 rand. The quantity of money I have as a nominal value is 100. and the price of every single good I can buy is exactly 1 rand. What is the real value of my money supply? In other words, how many real goods can I buy for 100 rand if the price of every single good is 1 rand? I can buy exactly 100 goods. Yes? Okay. If my money supply, my quantity of money, right, my nominal money supply stays the same, so I still have exactly 100 rand, but the price level doubles and everything now costs 2 rand. What is the real value of my money supply? In other words, what is my real money supply? 50 rand. Exactly. Right? The real value of my money supply changes if the price level changes. Yes? So, if the price level goes up, what should happen to my money supply curve? Real money supply curve. This is the real money market. That's right. The real money supply curve is going to shift to the left. In fact, let's do it like this. This is the money supply at, say, price level P0. Now, let's say that prices increase so that I've got some other price level P1, P1 being greater than P0. My money supply curve will shift to the left so that my money supply decreases. Okay, so P1 is greater than P0. Okay. Now I want to go back to my LM curve. If I have an LM curve which plots the relationship between I and Y, if I shift my money supply to the left, what happens to my LM curve? If my money supply decreases, what happens to my LM curve? That's what it does, it shifts to the left. Okay? Are you happy with the fact that when I shift the money supply, my LM curve shifts? You guys happy with that? Which means if the price level changes, which has a real effect on my money supply, it's going to have an effect on my LM curve. Yes? Great. So now if we add an IS curve, at my initial price level P0, I've got some equilibrium interest rate I0 and some equilibrium output level Y0. I increase my prices. What happens? I change my equilibrium interest rate from I0 to I1. In other words, my interest rate increases, which we know is going to happen because we can see that from our money market. When we decrease money supply, that increases interest rates. So interest rates, interest rates increase from I0 to I1, okay? Because our real money supply has decreased. So we can, in fact, we can label these as well, MS1 and MS0. So our money supply decreases, and as a result of money supply decreasing, interest rates go up. In our ISLM model, interest rates go up, but not only that, output goes down. So now if I would like to try to understand the relationship between price level and level of output, okay, based on the goods market, which is to say the aggregate expenditure model, as well as the money market, because we're dealing with money as it is used to purchase these goods. So we're combining the goods market and we're combining the money market. So yeah, aggregate expenditure model and money model, money market model. Technically, this is the goods market from the expenditure side, so the expenditure side of the goods market. Okay. What is our relationship between price and output based on this ISLM here? What happens when I raise the price level to the equilibrium level of output? That's exactly what happens. So if I had some price level P0 corresponding to some output level Y0, okay? When I raise the price, when I increase prices to P1, what happens to my equilibrium level of output? It decreases. And if I plot all those points together, I get a downward sloping relationship, right? And what is this relationship showing me? It's showing me how expenditure changes when price level changes. Hence, I'm dealing with an aggregate demand relationship. How does demand for goods and services, which comes from spending, aggregate demand, spending, change when price changes? Okay, so we saw that in our money market, when the price level goes up, money supply, real money supply decreases, which raises the interest rate and decreases real money supply, which shifts our LM curve to the left. That increase in interest rates moves us leftwards along our IS curve. An increase in interest rates does what? It decreases interest-sensitive expenditure, such as investment. An increase in interest rates moves us leftwards along the IS curve and decreases the level of expenditure and output that accompanies that expenditure. In other words, it shifts our aggregate expenditure curve downwards in our AE model. So at a higher price level, we have a lower equilibrium level of expenditure on our AD curve. Yeah? Everyone happy that we can derive this aggregate demand curve from what's happening in our aggregate expenditure model and what's happening in our money market model. And when we bring those two things together, what we are dealing with essentially is the ISLM model. Okay? And any changes in those markets can be reflected in my ISLM model, which is what we saw here. There was a change in my money market because of a change in prices, which was reflected in my ISLM model. The change in prices shifted my LM curve, which moved me from a point of equilibrium in my aggregate expenditure model here, which was point A, to a different point of equilibrium, point B. At point B, my aggregate expenditure model is in equilibrium, and at point B, my money market is in equilibrium. So I'm happy that at point B, I have equilibrium in the aggregate expenditure model and in the money market, which means that at this point AD, let's call it here A as well, at point A, I had equilibrium in my aggregate expenditure model and in my money market model. Then I changed prices and I moved to point B, but at point B, I still have equilibrium in my aggregate expenditure and in my money market model. So my aggregate demand curve, any point on my aggregate demand curve, is a point of equilibrium in my aggregate expenditure model and a point of equilibrium in my money market. So there's a lot happening in that one aggregate demand curve, right? So if at some point you see a question about aggregate demand and you find yourself a little bit lost, well, not surprising, there's a lot of things happening in there, right? Okay, yeah.
Do you say any point in the aggregate demand curve?
Yes.
Point of equilibrium in the
Absolutely. Yes. Okay? So we've derived our aggregate demand relationship from our, well, here we started with our MD model. Not MD, our money supply, our money market model. We started from our money market model, we moved through our ISLM, and we arrived at our ASAD. What we saw when we looked at the aggregate expenditure model, however, was that when prices change, when we were dealing with chapter 27, when prices change, a change in price causes a shift in the aggregate expenditure curve and changes our point of equilibrium, right? We saw how that happens in the aggregate expenditure model. Well, that's exactly what we are describing here. There was a change in price, which shifted our LM curve. That shift in the LM curve moves us along the IS curve. That movement along the IS curve is a shift in the aggregate expenditure curve due to a change in prices. So, a change in the money market is reflected in the aggregate demand curve. A change in the aggregate expenditure model is also reflected in the aggregate demand curve. Cool. Everyone happy with this idea? Maybe happy is too strong a word, huh? Okay. Do you have any questions at this point about how to derive aggregate demand from the ISLM model? If not, great. That brings us to the end then of our ISLM chapter. Apart from just a discussion, which I don't need to do with you, you can do it. If you have a horizontal LM curve, what happens when you increase government spending? Well, you have an increase in output with no change in interest rates. What happens if you have a vertical LM curve and you increase government spending? Then you have no change in output and only a change in interest rates. So if our LM curve is horizontal, is expansionary government policy effective? Does it achieve what it wants to achieve? What does expansionary government policy want to achieve? An increase in output and an increase in employment, for example, because an increase in output brings an increase in employment. Okay? So if our LM curve was horizontal, we have expansionary fiscal policy. Is it effective? Yeah. What about if our LM curve is vertical? If we have expansionary fiscal policy, does it do anything? No. So if you're going to have an argument between two economists about how effective is fiscal policy, if one believes that the LM curve is horizontal and the other one believes it's vertical, you're going to have two totally opposing positions. One, on the one hand, is going to say expansionary fiscal policy is good. The other one is going to say expansionary fiscal policy is not going to do anything except change interest rates. Okay? And remember that a change in interest rates is actually going to have, if you see, we've got a shift in our IS curve, and this distance, if this was our change in fiscal policy, in other words, this is change in government spending, that increase in interest rates is going to leave our total output, in other words, our total spending unchanged. If we then compare the new equilibrium interest rate, with the old equilibrium level of expenditure, we see that we've got a change in government spending. How can we have an increase in government spending with no change in overall expenditure? Because that change in government spending is exactly counteracted. So that was an increase in government spending is exactly counteracted by a decrease in investment spending because of the change in interest rates. We had an increase in interest rates, which just meant investment spending decreased. So even though there was an increase in government spending, there's no change in overall expenditure because interest-sensitive expenditure decreases. We call that crowding out. We've substituted private expenditure for government expenditure with no change in output in the economy. So if you believe that the LM curve is very steep, then government expansionary fiscal policy is not a good option. If you believe it's very flat, great. There's no change in interest rates, there's no crowding out. No problem. That's great for our economy. How do we know whether the LM curve is vertical or horizontal? Well, we have to get data and try and figure out exactly what the state of the economy is. And that's very difficult to try and find out. Okay, so we've derived the aggregate demand curve, and we finished with this. Great stuff. Our chapter 28 then, here we go, is all about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We've been introduced to aggregate demand. Now we're going to talk more about aggregate supply as well as aggregate demand. So what are we doing in this chapter? What are our objectives? We're going to look a lot at aggregate supply. We're going to explain the determinants. Sorry, let me change the color here. Okay, we're going to explain the determinants of aggregate supply. And we're going to distinguish between the long run and the short run. So what determines aggregate supply in the long run? What determines aggregate supply in the short run? Then we're going to illustrate these determinants. We're going to see how changes in these determinants are obviously either going to cause a change in the long or short run supply curve. In other words, illustrate how these factors cause the aggregate supply curve to shift. Okay? So that's our supply side. Then we're going to do the same for demand. Explain the determinants of aggregate demand. Then we're going to illustrate them and see how they shift. See how changes in those factors shift the aggregate demand curve. Then we're going to bring aggregate demand and aggregate supply together to explain how real GDP and price level are determined. In other words, how do we get equilibrium? Okay? Maybe that EQ doesn't explain much. Equilibrium. And then we'll see what happens when we shift aggregate supply. So in other words, when we change aggregate supply or aggregate demand, when we shift those curves, how does that change our equilibrium real GDP, and how does that change our price level? In other words, how does that bring about economic growth, which would be an increase in GDP, and how does it affect inflation? In other words, how does it change the price level? And then, depending on how these things change over time, obviously we're dealing with the business cycle. So we're all the way back to chapter 21. So we saw in chapter 21 that there was this relationship over time between output. So if this is our trend over time, and we're plotting output over time, we saw in chapter 21 that it kind of looks like this, right? We're going to see in a model how we get something that looks like that. Okay, we're going to use a model to derive that phenomenon. And then there's going to be a quick discussion on the different kinds of schools of thought. So I mentioned in the ISLM chapter that depending on what you think the LM curve is doing is going to influence how you feel government should be intervening in the economy. Okay? These are going to be characterized by different schools of thought. People who believe different things about how the economy actually operates. What are the actual characteristics of the economy, which then determine how you feel actors such as government should intervene or not. Now, even though we've spoken about aggregate demand in the previous set of slides, we're now going to change our tune and talk about aggregate supply. So all of our discussion so far has been on the demand side. When we spoke about the money market, it was about demand side effects, right? Because it was money for purchasing. That was what the money market is about, purchasing stuff. It was the aggregate expenditure model, which is all about what do people do with their income? How do they spend? Okay? How does spending affect income? How does income affect spending? Okay? We brought those two together to form the ISLM model, and then we use that ISLM model to derive aggregate demand. All of that is demand side stuff. What we want to know is, well, what about the supply side? Okay? The last time we spoke about the supply side was when we did chapter 23, I think it was. Maybe it was chapter 22, I can't remember, when we spoke about employment and the market for labor. What was that, chapter 22? Chapter 22, okay. So last time we spoke about supply in any way was in chapter 22. Since then, the discussion has been about demand. Now we're returning to a discussion about supply. Any issues or questions? No? Okay. So, the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model explains how real GDP and price level are determined and how they interact. Let's talk about supply. Aggregate supply is the relationship between quantity of real GDP supplied and price level. What is the nature of this relationship? Well, it depends on whether we are talking about the short run or the long run. So there are two different time frames. Short run, and we'll discuss short run, and then, did I miss it? Sorry, long run, we discussed it on here somewhere as well. Oh, sorry, here we go, long run. Okay, so first, short run. Short run aggregate supply is the relationship between the quantity of real GDP supplied and the price level when the money wage rate and the price of other resources as well as the potential GDP remain constant. In other words, if we assume that money wage rate as well as the price of any other resources, in other words, the cost of any kind of inputs, if we assume that those are fixed, so if we treat money wage, so in other words, I'm going to put here W, we're going to have the money wage rate, which we'll just call, how do I do this? W over P equals WR. That's the real wage rate. So once we adjust W, and I'm going to call W, let me rewrite this quickly, WN. WN meaning the nominal money wage rate, the money wage rate, divided by the price level gives us the real wage rate. Okay? What we are assuming at this point in time is that W over N, I'm putting a bar over there, it's fixed. W over N, fixed. That is our assumption. Okay? Well, that's one of our assumptions. That's our first one. The cost of resources is fixed. The second is that potential GDP is not changing. When we say potential GDP, we also mean full employment output. Okay? Potential GDP, full employment output, and another term for full employment output is long run aggregate supply. So if we're assuming that the long run aggregate supply remains constant and we fix the nominal wage rate, that gives us a specific relationship between the quantity of goods and services that are supplied, in other words, the quantity of real GDP supplied at any given price level. And what we find is that the short run relationship, in other words, the relationship when we assume that wages are fixed and that we are not changing the long run level of equilibrium full employment output, in other words, for example, capital is fixed. Okay? Then what we have is this upward sloping relationship. In other words, then we find that as the price level increases, the quantity of GDP supplied increases. Alternatively, if the price level falls, then the quantity falls as well. How do we end up with that relationship? Well, we will talk more about that in detail in a moment. First, let's talk about how we shift the supply curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve, and how we shift the long-run aggregate supply curve. Remember, the long-run aggregate supply curve, we're assuming things like capital are fixed. Short-run aggregate supply curve, we're assuming that things like nominal wage rates is fixed. Change in aggregate supply. Well, a change in the price level is going to cause a change in the quantity of real GDP supplied. In other words, it does not change the aggregate supply curve. It doesn't shift the entire supply curve. A change in price is a movement along. However, aggregate supply changes when an influence on production plans other than the price level changes. Okay? So what will shift our short-run aggregate supply curve? Not a change in price, but when potential GDP changes, in other words, when our long-run aggregate supply curve shifts, okay? So if we had some price level, 110, okay? And we had some equilibrium level, and we had, some potential level of output, 1.3, and we increase our capital stock, for example, then we can produce more, okay? Which means at any given price level, for example, our same given price level, 110, we are now going to be able to produce more, okay? Which would shift our long-run aggregate supply curve. But with the shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve comes an equal shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve, okay? So now we have the same relationship with short-run aggregate supply curve as we did originally. We just have it at a different level of output. Does everyone get that? Is everyone with me on that? Why they shift together? No? Okay? The long-run aggregate supply curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve. The short-run aggregate supply curve says that if I change the price level, I will increase the level of output if I increase the price level. If I decrease the price level, I will decrease the level of output, right? But not the potential amount of output that I can produce. This is just a short-run change, okay? So if you remember the distinction between, for example, cyclical unemployment and frictional or structural unemployment, okay? If we're at full employment, we have no cyclical unemployment, but we have some level of frictional unemployment and some level of structural. Now, if the price level increases and we want to take advantage of that increase in price level, maybe we just hire some people that we want to use temporarily, right? We don't want to employ them permanently, but we want to get some staff on board because we see prices are going up. We want to be able to produce more now. So we don't go through our normal hiring process, right, that we would for like a permanent staff member. So we just hire some people temporarily, okay? What's that going to do to the frictional unemployment? It's going to decrease that frictional unemployment. In other words, it'll decrease the amount of time that people are in unemployment because they are quickly getting absorbed into the labor market. You with me? Which means we will be able to produce a little bit more, right, because of that increase in price level. But if we want to keep those people as permanent staff, we're not going to change our hiring processes, right? So our hiring processes are still going to take a while. If the price level then, even though the price level increased, if, for example, it suddenly decreased, we get rid of those temporary staff members and we just move back, right? We're not changing the amount of, we're not changing the permanent labor staff. We're not changing the amount of capital that we have because of this price level. If we think that the price level change is temporary, we just want to get in there, quickly take advantage of these prices. If we see the prices are going to remain elevated for a long time and it's profitable for us to then produce more, maybe we increase our capital, right? If we increase our capital, our long-run aggregate supply curve no longer remains stationary. Our long-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right if we increase capital. You with me? But even though we've shifted our long-run aggregate supply curve, if we assume that prices are just remain the same at 110, if we've increased our long run aggregate supply curve, we still have that same short run aggregate supply curve relationship at that price level. In other words, even if we increase our production because we've got more capital and we're producing more, if prices were to increase, we would want to quickly try and take advantage of that increase in prices. We want to hire more people, right? We want to maybe, in order to do that, we pay people some higher wages, whatever the case may be, right? In fact, in the short run, we're assuming that the nominal wage is fixed, so we wouldn't be hiring, we wouldn't be paying, we wouldn't be increasing wages to get people on board quickly. We would just, there's frictional unemployment, and there are people out there. We just don't take our normal vetting process and we bring them on board, right? Everyone happy with that idea? Okay. So this short run aggregate supply curve is dependent on where the long run aggregate supply curve is. And no matter where the long run aggregate supply curve is, you will have a corresponding short run aggregate supply curve. So when we shift the long run aggregate supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve just moves with it. Okay? They move together. So any factors that shift the long run aggregate supply curve will shift the short run aggregate supply curve. So when potential GDP changes, we're shifting the aggregate short run aggregate supply curve. Why would potential GDP increase? Well, if, for example, we have an increase in the labor force, okay, so an increase in full employment quantity of labor. Why? Because we have an increase in the labor force, or we have, sorry, when I say the labor force, let's say we have an increase in labor supply, or we have an increase in productivity. Both of those are going to increase full employment quantity of labor. What is going to increase productivity? Well, one of the things that could increase productivity is an increase in the quantity of capital. Alternatively, we could have advances in technology. So productivity is a labor demand shift. So an increase in labor supply or an increase in labor demand shifts full employment quantity of labor. What increases labor demand? Well, an increase in productivity through either increases in capital or advances in technology. What increases labor supply? Well, increases in population. Okay, so population, labor force, those increase our labor supply. Okay? Everyone with me on that curve? Okay? Now we're going to get a little bit complicated, and the textbook does not show a diagram of this, and so I'm going to draw this for you. And then maybe you get out a piece of paper and a pen as well. Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm saying the thing that increases labor supply, one of the things that increases labor supply would be like an increase. If your total population increased, right, you would expect an increase in your labor force, and within that labor force you would expect an increase in employment.
So that means potential GDP cannot increase in supply?
Not in terms of the model, no. An increase in output does not increase labor supply. It can increase the quantity of labor supplied, so it can cause a movement along a labor supply curve, but it cannot shift a labor supply curve. What I'm talking about here, where's my little thing? What I'm talking about here is here, an increase in full employment. An increase in full employment means an increase in the intercept value of labor demand and labor supply, right? An increase in the Y intercept value. And that Y intercept value can increase if either the labor demand curve shifts, which would then cause a movement along a labor supply curve, okay? In which case an increase in productivity and an increase in output is causing an increase in labor supply quantity, right? Quantity of labor supplied, but not the entire labor supply curve. And if labor demand does not shift, the other alternative is for labor supply to shift. What causes a shift in the entire labor supply curve? Well, that would be, for example, an increase in population.
Is labor supply the same thing as aggregate supply?
No. Aggregate supply is supply of output. Okay? So in our, whatever, I've closed the other slides. Aggregate demand is demand for output, not demand for labor, demand for output. Aggregate supply is supply of output, not supply of labor. Of course, in order to supply more output, we will probably be employing more laborers, right? The quantity of labor employed is likely to be increasing when we increase output, right? But aggregate supply as a relationship is about the supply of output. Okay. Cool. Now let's piece of paper and pen, and let's just try and make sense of how this works. And it's not easy to work with, so I'm going to call labor L, and then we're going to derive the short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so we've got output and we've got price level. So in our labor market, where we've got wage here, if we deal with the real wage, so let's call this WR, and WR is going to be equal to the nominal wage, WN, over the price level. Okay? So let's say we have some equilibrium level of in our labor market, sorry. So we've got labor demand, labor supply, which gives us some equilibrium wage rate. Okay? Let's call it WR0 and L0. Okay? Now, if you recall from our production function, if I'm plotting L against output, if I have some level of employment L0, it's going to give me some level of output Y0. Okay? So I'm just going to plot down here, L0 gives me Y0. Okay? Which comes from my production function. So let me just label these so that I'm not being lazy. Production function. This then is the labor market. And over here we have the ASAD, in other words, our full economy, right? This is basically once we combine the demand for goods and the supply of goods. Okay, so we can call it the goods market as well if we want to, but different from the aggregate expenditure goods market, because here the goods market, where we're dealing with both the demand for goods and the supply of goods, in other words, production as well. So I would prefer to call the ASAD model just the economy. Okay, and we have some equilibrium level of output with some equilibrium price level P0, where AD0 and AS0 meet. Okay? So WR0 is going to correspond to some wage rate WN0 and this price level P0. Okay, so we've got this price level P0. Okay. Now this labor supply, okay, and this is where the model gets tricky, because now we're going to start talking about something called expectations. So people have expectations. This is the labor that people will supply if they expect the price level to be P0. Okay? And in other words, sorry, let's do this quickly. This is the labor they supply given that they expect wages to be WN0. Wait, I don't want to do it like that. They expect two things, WN0 and they expect P0. Okay? Which means, in a sense, it gives them this gives them some expectation of what the real wage is. In other words, if they've got an expectation about if they know what the nominal wage is and they know what the price level is, they know what the real wage rate is. Okay? If they get confused between these two things, in other words, if they think that the nominal wage rate is one thing and they expect that the price level is one thing, and it turns out that the price level is not what they expected, it means that the real wage rate will not be what they expected. Okay. So this is their expectation. I'm going to just write here expected. Expected. Okay. What happens in this model? It's 12 o'clock. Okay. I'm going to give you a quick rundown and then we're going to start next week. Okay. What happens? When the price level increases, okay, people do not realize that the price level has increased. That increase in the price level decreases the real wage. The decrease in real wage moves you down the labor demand curve. Okay? But that decrease in real wage does not come, right, is not the laborers supplying labor do not realize that their wage has actually decreased. Because they do not realize that their wage has actually decreased, the quantity of labor that they are prepared to supply at any given wage rate actually increases. In other words, their labor supply is for a wage that they get wrong. Okay? They think the wage is one thing and it's not. And so there's a temporary increase in the amount of people you can employ if your wage rate is fixed, given our model. Okay? So as we increase labor employed, we increase output, we move temporarily to a higher level of output when the wage increases. And we'll talk about that next week. Okay. Any questions? Come through. We'll finish this next week, Wednesday, and then we'll start talking more about inflation and unemployment in relation to this model on Thursday.